Welcome to this fifth lesson, which is completely dedicated to the instincts. When we're studying the Enneagram, we normally focus on the types, and indeed the core teaching of the Enneagram is about the 9 Enneatypes. But the 3 instincts are equally important, I would say. And if you really want to understand your personality, your motivations, your behavior, you should really look at the combination of your type and your instincts. Now, as we will see, this is extremely important in sex. And I would actually say that the core or the basis of our sexual behavior is actually determined by the instinct. And the type and the passion and the ego fixation of our type just give it some kind of additional flavor. It adds some kind of nuances to this base. So before we look in the next lessons at the influence of the passions and the ego fixations, let's take a closer look at the instincts. When we're talking about sex, then you would think about the sexual instinct, right? And to a certain extent that is true, because we will see that a lot of the parameters of our sexual behavior are actually determined by the strength or the absence of a sexual instinct. Well, it's never fully absent, it's just repressed, and it may not be playing a dominating role, but it is definitely there. And also, if we're looking in the animal world, for example, I mean, if you look at how animals fornicate, there's nothing about self-preservation in there, right? It's all about venturing into the unknown. Also, if we're looking at sex and the social instinct, if we're looking at the animals, it's only in some primates, I would say, that you really see the social instinct showing up in the sexual act. And as a matter of fact, actually, if you look, I mean, everything about sex is actually going against the core principles of the self-preservation instinct, because sex actually requires you to go outside of the status quo and your comfort zone. You have to leave security, you have to venture into the unknown. It's all about taking risk. It's all about spending massive amounts of energy without having any guarantee for success. So actually, in the animal world, this self-preservation instinct is actually more of a handicap than an asset for sex. If in the animal world, the sexual instinct is definitely the driving motor or the driving force. Now, for humans, it's a little bit different. Indeed, the sexual instinct is still playing a crucial role, but also the 2 other instincts somehow show up. Basically, also the self-preservation and the social instinct give some kind of specific characteristics or some kind of specific qualities to the sexual act that we're going to look at in detail in the next 2 hours or so. So I already mentioned the instincts a little bit when I was talking about the meaning of sex. We also spoke a little bit about the sexual instinct when we were looking at the flirting and seduction strategies. But in this lesson, I really want to give a very structured and conceptual overview of how the different instincts play out in sex. And we're going to look at it through the angle of Russ Hudson's zones. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the work of Russ Hudson on the instincts, he basically subdivides every instinct into 3 zones. And each of these 9 zones is comprised of 5 instinctual habits. Now, we will not look at 45 instinctual habits, we will just look at these 9 zones. So for those of you who are familiar with the 9 zones, it'll be easy for you to understand. If you're not familiar with these zones, don't worry, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, what it also shows is that if you are, let's say, self-preservation dominant, it does not mean that everything from the self-preservation instinct is going to fully apply to you. It is possible that something is actually going to be repressed in there. I mean, Ross Hudson came up with 15 instinctual habits for each of these instincts, and it doesn't mean that if you are self-preservation dominant that all these 15 instinctual habits are going to be extremely strong. So instead of looking through the angle of what is my dominant instinct, what is my blind or my repressed instinct, just look at to what extent is this instinct present in myself and in my sexual behavior? And even more deeply, like, how is each of these 9 zones playing a role in my sexual life? So maybe you should even almost forget about the instincts and just look at these 9 zones and how they play out. It's also important to see that these 9 zones are not just there in a vacuum. They all interact with each other. So one of these zones can actually strengthen the effect of another zone, or it may actually go against the impact of one zone. But as we will go on in this course, it'll probably come a bit clearer. It's also very important to understand that when we're thinking of the instincts and sex, you should not only look at the instincts. So if you want to compare, you should not compare a sexual, you should not believe that all sexual dominants are going to be similar. So if you want to compare, you should only compare a self-preservation 8 with a sexual 8 or with a social 8, so or a self-pres 7 with a sexual 7, but you should not start comparing the sexual 8 with the sexual 4, for example. Another remark that I want to make beforehand is that I'm only giving some kind of tendencies. I mean, if I say that people who score high in this or that zone have typically this or that behavior, it's just a tendency. It does not mean that this will be applied to everybody who has a high score in this specific zone. Because if we take, for example, type 4, type 4 can sometimes be, I would say, something like counter-instinctual. They may be a little bit different. But so let's start with the self-preservation instinct in this video. Now, the self-preservation instinct is all about being alive. And when we're talking about the motivations of sex, we already said that sex is mainly about just having the needs met. So it's very binary. Either the need is met or it's not met. If the need is not met, I want to meet it. If the need is met, then I can move on to another need, basically. So Ross Hudson came up with 3 zones, and the first zone in the self-preservation instinct is the self-care zone. In the biological sense, the self-care zone is all about physical well-being, but also in a psychological sense, it's about some kind of emotional well-being. So people who score high or so who are very strong in the self-care zone, they want to have their basic needs met before engaging in sexual activity. Sex is also a basic need, but it's on a different place in the hierarchy. And really you should look at try to create some kind of hierarchy of needs. So for example, some people are not able to eat if they're tired, but they can sleep if they're hungry. Or people are not able to eat if they have to go to the toilet, but they can go to the toilet if they're hungry. So you really need to build up this kind of hierarchy, and you're going to see that actually for most people, this need for sex is going to be somewhere below. So very often, people who score high in a self-care zone probably don't want, or they're not really able to enjoy sex and even have sex if they are tired, if they're hungry or thirsty. It's basically the need for sleep, to drink or eat is just going to overshadow the need for having sex. Now on the other side, people who have a weak self-preservation instinct and people who score very low on the self-care zone, they don't care too much about the self-care. They're not really going to be bothered about that. They can have sex on an empty stomach, And if in the middle of the night their partner wakes them up and they're being approached in the right way, they can actually have sex. They will be in for some play. It's not going to disturb them. And the second thing that I wanted to say about the self-care zone is more about the psychological well-being. Now, as we already saw, sex is a good tool for getting rid of stress. But there is an interesting remark to be made here for the self-preservation dominant, and especially the ones who score high in the self-care zone. Basically, if a person with a high score here doesn't feel mentally and emotionally at ease or comfortable, they're going to find it very difficult to get aroused. If they're not feeling psychologically at ease, if they're feeling stressed, it's very difficult for them to have sex. The second zone that Russ Hudson came up with in the self-preservation instinct is the resources and practicality zone. And this cluster of instinctual habits is all about how we are using our resources, time and energy. And it really gives people some kind of sense of persistence, consistency and practical know-how. So how does this show up in sex? Well, people who score high in this resources and practicality zone, they are very, very aware of the expenditure of their energy. And they can be extremely down to earth when it comes down to sex. And very often these people are going to be in some kind of permanent energy efficiency or energy saving mode. It basically means that they're not going to show up in a very active way in the bedroom normally. They care about the needs of their partner, but very often it feels as if they have to do a lot of work in order to please the partner. And in some cases, and especially the self-preservation 5 is a good example where you can see it very often, is that they may sometimes decide not to have sex if they know that the next day is going to be very busy. So basically they want to preserve their energy, they want to go to sleep early, they want to have enough sleep. And another thing with people who score high in the resources and practicality zone is that they often prioritize domestic tasks over sex. And there's always something to do at home. So very often sex again is put as a last priority in this list of needs. And of course, if you've been working hard, at the end of the day, there is hardly energy left for sex. So people who score high in this resources and practicality zone, they may be very interested in some kind of rougher sex and in experimenting, but they prefer to be more on the passive and on the receiving end. And they prefer that the partner is somehow in the lead in sex. They may also have lots of fantasies, but very often they may not act on these fantasies just because the logistics are too difficult and they require just too much effort to really make it happen. Something very common also for people who score high in this resources and practicality zone is that they do not like to play an active part in foreplay. They like to be on the recipient side, but they don't want to really give their partner a massage or anything like that because it feels somehow as if it's wasted energy. Because let's not forget that the meaning of sex for the self-preservation instinct is all about the functional meaning, right? It's about just having an orgasm. So foreplay doesn't serve the purpose in the mindset or in the logic of the self-preservation instinct. And you could mistake that for believing that people who are high in self-preservation, so high in these resources and practicality zone, you could mistakenly believe that these people have a low sex drive, that they have a low libido, which is not true. They are indeed reluctant to spend a lot of energy in the bedroom, and they're not prone on spending too much energy on acting on their desires. And they can indeed but they can be perceived as somehow lazy and boring in the bedroom, but that doesn't mean that they have a low sexual desire. But what is very important here is that this lack of action, which is not a lack of libido from their side, can actually kill the libido of the partner, because the partner may indeed get the wrong impression that they're not being desired. And as a result, if you don't feel desired, then it is really going to kill your libido. And of course, here we need to differentiate between the different subtypes. It does not mean that everybody who has a very strong resources and practicality zone of this self-preservation instinct, that they are all going to be inactive, that they all will be passive. I mean, for example, the self-preservation 8 is going to be quite different. I mean, the self-preservation 8 is actually going to be quite active. Of course, still not as active as the sexual 8, but the self-preservation 8 is not going to be as passive and as much as a recipient as types 4 or 5, for example. So basically, to really understand this, for the resource and practicality zone, the outcome or the result of the sexual encounter really has to be worth the effort. So basically, the outcome has to be more important than the energy that you put in there. So basically, it's like in physics, it's some kind of physical formula, you could say, that the outcome has to be bigger than the input. Now, what does this actually mean, and also for the sexual play? Well, concretely, people who score high on resources and practicality zone, for them, ideally, in sex, they'll just lay back, get a nice treatment from the partner, and preferably this partner is not going to ask for anything in return, and the partner is going to take care of his or her own orgasm without much help of the person with this very strong self-preservation instinct. Now, the interesting part is also that people are incapable of telling to what extent they're active, to what extent they're putting a lot of effort in there. So quite often these, let's call them energy efficient people, may be actively receiving, but they may actually believe that they are equally active, or that they're actually even more active than their partner, which is not the case. And it is this discrepancy that can often cause some kind of problems with the partner. Now, the second best scenario for these people relates to masturbation, because masturbation is actually something very functional, right? I mean, if your aim is just to get an orgasm, then masturbation is really going to do the trick, and you don't need to think about your partner. I mean, masturbation serves the purpose of getting the orgasm, and yes, it does not create a connection with the partner, but for the self-preservation instinct, that's not the key thing. So what we have seen is that in couples where both score high on self-preservation, and especially in this resources and practicality zone, some of these couples are actually going to say that for them, if they are just both laying next to each other in bed and each is masturbating, that this is actually a very nice part of their sexual repertoire. And sure, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if this gives you some kind of sexual satisfaction and you feel fine as a couple, why not? Now, the worst case scenario for people who score very high in these resources and practicality zone is that they are with a partner who demands a lot of attention. If they are with a partner who is not active him or herself, but actually wants this person to play an active role. So if they have to spend a lot of energy in pleasing the partner, and then they're actually expected to take care of their own needs, then they think like, well, what's the point? I mean, why should I go through this hassle? This is just too much work. It's demotivating to them. And at the end of the day, it's actually creating some kind of resentment. They may really feel sexually aroused, they may have sexual desire, but just the whole anticipation of having to put in so much work just completely demotivates them, and this resentment can really lead to problems in the relationship. Some will be very outspoken about it, others are just going to swallow their resentment and they're not going to tell their partner. Maybe a final thing that I want to say about this energy efficiency is that people who have a strong self-preservation instinct, and especially who score high in this resources and practicality zone, they're a little bit like, or quite often, they're like old diesel motors. I mean, it's very slow for them to warm up, but once they're there, they really like it. So quite often these people may not want to have sex because they don't have the energy, but once they are in the sexual play, then they actually say that, hey, this is actually nice, I mean, we should do this more often. But it's just about not being able to get into it. They don't have the energy to get started. So then let's move to the third zone of the self-preservation instinct. This zone is called home life, by Russ Hudson. And it's all about our relationship to structure, organization, safety, security, privacy, and comfort. So it all boils down to feeling well, about feeling at ease. So what makes us feel at ease with regard to sex, or why is it important? Well, the first aspect is that people who score high in this home life, for them it is very important that they feel physically in a place that is somehow safe, secure, and comfortable. So basically, home is basically their place. They feel at ease at home, and this is where I can really be I. So if they have sex in a safe and known environment, in their own house or apartment, this is really perfect. But if they are in a place that they don't really know, if, for example, they met somebody and they're going to have sex in the apartment of the partner, for example, they may not feel at ease. I mean, like, it's like not their place. They're not feeling comfortable. Or if they would go to a hotel, of course they may like the romanticism of the whole thing, but still it's like, well, they don't really know the place. And also the next morning waking up in a room they don't know can really feel weird to them. They just feel more protected in their own place, and they can really relax and surrender at home, because surrendering is key to the sexual experience. The other thing is that they can also get turned off by the discomfort of a small bed, or having sex in a tent, for example, on a camping ground is also something they don't like. Or the idea of just having sex in a car may sound very appealing, but it's horribly uncomfortable. I mean, they don't like it. Or having sex on the beach sounds very erotic, but the sand is just disturbing and you can get sunburned. Or having sex in a forest, I mean, you can get scratches, or it can be itchy if you get poisoned or rashes from some kind of poison oak or something like that. So they don't want to have sex in this kind of places where they don't feel physically at ease. People who are scoring very low in this home life zone, people who are self-preservation blind or self-preservation repressed, they don't feel much influenced by the place. I mean, they probably don't understand what I was talking about. They can just have sex in any place, and actually having sex in an unknown place is even more arousing to them. Another important part of this home life is that comfort also means that they want to have sex in a place that is somehow clean. I mean, the room and the bed, they prefer that it's tidy. They prefer a setting which is calm. The domestic tasks should all be done. Kids should be in bed. They prefer that nobody else is in the house. I mean, if things get too excited, they don't want to be disturbed, or they don't want anybody to hear them. They also care very much about hygiene, so people should have taken a shower. So if you think about it, there's a lot of preparatory work for people who score high in the home life zone. And actually, this is not really conducive to desire and arousal. Arousal needs some kind of spontaneity, needs something about the unknown. And this is something that people with a strong home life zone are actually not good at. So when we're talking about home life, it's not only about physically feeling at home, but it's also about emotionally feeling at home. It's about feeling mentally at ease with oneself. Now, we already spoke about it a little bit with regards to having sex and fights and the stressful situations. But also here in the home life zone, this kind of fighting the impact of fights show up. As we'll see later, people with a strong sexual instinct, they can rebound very quickly after a conflict or a fight with their partner. The moment they have come to an agreement, the conflict is over, they can immediately move to sex, and they'll say that this is a great way for reconnecting. But for people who score high in this home life zone, they need more time. They need more time to digest the conflict, which indeed is over already, but there's still this kind of residual impact, and it takes quite some time to get this conflict fully out of the system, especially if there was anger involved. So for people who score high on this home life zone, it can also be a little bit more difficult to feel emotionally or mentally comfortable when they are with a partner who is very intense, because for them it's all about being at ease. It's about not having too much intensity. So quite often people who are self-preservation dominant, they may actually prefer to go for a partner who's a little bit timid, because they will have this feeling that there's a more pragmatic way of building up the trust and really getting to a place from where they feel at ease to have sex. There's one more aspect related to this home life zone, and it's I already said that they need to feel physically at ease with the location, with the setting, with the room or the bed where they are. But it's also with regards to feeling at ease with the body. So it's very much about being sensitive to which body parts are touched. It's about knowing where they want to be touched, where they don't want to be touched. So they really know what is physically pleasurable or painful, and they don't like to have sex in uncomfortable positions. So for example, if you have a leg which is pushing against your head or a hand which is squeezing your breast, it just may feel too much for them. They don't like that. But on the contrary, people who score very low in this home life zone, they don't mind that a position is not comfortable. I mean, they may not like it if it's not comfortable, but somehow the arousal and the passion is just overriding this sense of not feeling comfortable. Basically, people who score low in this zone, they can more easily forget about the lack of physical comfort, and they can increase, they have a higher level of tolerance, you could say. So people who score low on this home life zone, so people who are self-preservation blind, they may actually, in the passion of the sexual play, they may bite or scratch their partner, and they're fine. But somebody who is very strong in this home life zone will really say like, hey, what the hell are you doing? And that's really going to kill, it's going to end the sexual play. So as a result of all of this, quite often people who are self-preservation dominant tend to be a little bit more vanilla in their own play. They may like a partner who's maybe a little bit more rough or intense, but they themselves tend to be more vanilla. Of course, this is a tendency, and we should not generalize. Another important aspect of this home life zone is basically the sensitivity to smell and hygiene. So basically, if preconditions are not met, these people may decide not to have sex. This does not mean that people who score low in home life zone, that they don't care about hygiene. No, it's just that if they have a very strong sexual instinct, this basically overrides this sensitivity. Basically, in the heat of the moment, they just forget about the hygiene. And it also explains why, for example, when people who are actually very high in this home life zone, when they are in the beginning of a relationship and the sexual instinct is activated, they may actually also forsake it. They may also care a little bit less about hygiene. But there is one other thing that I wanted to speak about, and that is also related to the emotional comfort and safety. And it's basically in order to have a satisfying sexual experience that includes a good orgasm, basically this requires surrendering. It requires one to give up control. Now, giving up control can basically be related also to sexual repression, a lack of knowledge, and so on. But there is one important thing here, and this is the home life zone again. Basically, people who score very strong in this home life zone, they don't want to get out of their comfort zone. They don't want to take physical or emotional risks. They basically want to stay in control. They often don't like to be blindfolded because they're unable to let go. They have quite often problems to trust the other partner. So people with a very strong home life zone very often have problems in achieving orgasm. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it's just more challenging. It's more difficult for them to get it. And the other thing is also that people with a strong self-preservation instinct, for them sex is mainly related to the orgasm. So they may be so focused on the orgasm that they're not able to get it. Just like in many other things in life, we may be so focused on something that we're just getting further away from it. Now, the last few things that I wanted to talk about is with regards to feeling safe and being safe, which is part of the home life zone. So when we're thinking about feeling safe in sex, then we'll be talking about safe sex. And well, people, they of course use protection and anti-conception in order to avoid contracting some kind of sexually transmittable diseases or infections, and also to avoid some kind of unplanned pregnancies. So for people who score very high in this home life zone, they're actually going to care more than some of the others about their own health. So they're going to be very considerate about birth control, and they may also even have a very pragmatic attitude towards condoms, because they can say that, well, you know, the condoms, they keep the mess away. So it doesn't mean that they actually like condoms, but they just have a different attitude to it than those that are self-preservation blind. And the last thing that I want to say about the home life zone is that people who score very high in this zone, they just stick to what is familiar. Very often they have their favorite positions, they want to stick to them, and they're quite reluctant to experiment and to try new things.